So, first question, of course, how are you doing? You're in New York, right?
Yeah.
And how are you doing during lockdown?
Um, it's it's been completely unprecedentedly crazy here. Um, just obviously nobody could have predicted what it was going to be like. But I think things like this is definitely the most surreal experience that I've had in New York City in the 10 plus years that I've lived here or been here um, on a regular basis. Like, certainly have never heard it as quiet um, as it was during the peak of the pandemic here, where basically, like, there was nobody outside, no traffic on the streets, and the only sound that you could consistently hear at any time, either directly outside the window or if you like strained your ears in the distance, was ambulance sirens. And then for it to go from that feeling here to 3 weeks later, basically like the loudest version of the city that I've ever experienced, with hundreds of thousands of people in the streets marching and protesting, and police choppers flying overhead, constantly surveilling the public, um, and then from all of that to like basically like industrial grade fireworks every night, which has been quite a topic of conversation. There are a lot of different theories about why that has been happening and how it's gotten around and stuff. But yeah, it's just been the strangest thing. And also, as I'm saying that, I don't know if this is going to be visible on camera, but no, it's totally not. But there's my coffee cup left like a smiley face of water on my coaster, and it was just staring up at me.
Yeah, it is. It is kind of the zombie apocalypse without zombies. It's unlike. I mean, I'm down in Nashville, and it's different than that, but it's still pretty. It's got its own issues with people just denying and not wearing masks and things like that. And then they have to open, and they go to stage two, and then they go to back to stage one, and all that kind of stuff. Are you healthy? Is everybody you know immediately doing okay?
Yeah, everybody's okay. Thank you for asking. We've had a few scares in our family, but everybody's cool, and just feeling grateful for that. What about you?
Yeah, we're knock on whatever. We're so far. I mean, we have family that has gone through it, but they're younger and they've seem to have gotten through it. But nobody immediately. Actually, a good friend of ours probably had it and seems to have gotten through it. But my wife and I, we just haven't gone anywhere. So, for the most part, we we don't. We're not too worried about it. I mean, so we're doing good on that score. I want to get into the National Sawdust thing because it was amazing. But before we jump into that, what have you been doing musically besides that during this period?
It's kind of crazy. It's been a lot, actually. And I had a solid couple weeks, like the week leading up to the lockdown and everything. I was actually in LA working on some things with my collaborators, Ryan and Ian, in the band Sunlux. And we were doing some work out there as all of these concerns were mounting and stuff. And we sort of got home at the last minute before everything started. And I think I had a couple weeks of basically just like crippling anxiety, like where I didn't get anything done. But after that, it's kind of been nonstop, and I'm not at liberty to talk about probably half of what I've been doing or two-thirds of what I've been doing at the moment, but a lot of that will start to make its way out pretty soon, so there isn't too much of a wait. But besides that, I mean, it was interesting that, yeah, like this sawdust thing and this exploration of layered guitar kind of, for me, coming from a place of having worked a lot more broadly in terms of the kinds of sounds and sound sources that I was drawing from, and actually like, coming off of a recording where there's hardly any guitar involved at all, to immerse myself back into the world of the guitar, and actually exclusively using the guitar to generate all of the sound, has been something that I've been spending quite a bit of time with during quarantine, because I wrote a piece for the Kronos Quartet at the beginning of, well, I'd been working on it already, but I finished it at the beginning of the lockdown, and that was also a situation which I used basically the same instrumentation as the Sawdust performance to generate the material, and I tuned the guitar to like the string quartet range and had it sitting in that tuning. But yeah, so it was, in a way, I've been in that space more than just that performance.
Well, I want to dig into that. Before we do, I because this is for the website, which means there's no lag time, I won't press you on what's coming up, because if it was for magazine, it sounds like it would all be happening by the time it hit. Right. But I am curious about how you're doing whatever you're doing. Is it remote, people doing their parts separately, or
Oh, the stuff that I said that I can't talk about.
Yeah, well, I mean, you don't have to talk about only as much as you're comfortable with.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I guess there's something that's fortunate to me about the way that I work, that has come in handy during this time, is that I'm already sort of like working in remote ways in a lot of the collaborative situations that I'm in. And there's a lot of like sharing, works in progress over the internet, and each person taking their time to sit with them in their own space and generating ideas and then sending things back and forth. So it's kind of been, I've just been doing it in the same way that I was working before, to a large part. I mean, the biggest obvious glaring thing is just like I haven't made music with other people in a very long time, and that's something that I deeply, deeply miss. But beyond that, like, I just feel really thankful and fortunate that I like had already sort of set myself up to be able to work from my own space, and I've been able to like continue to make headway with things that artistically were already like pursuits of mine. So
cool. Yeah, I want to get back to the Kronos thing, but it sounds like to talk about that, it would be good to talk about the National Sawdust performance first. So essentially, I mean, I watched it. I'm not totally ignorant about this kind of stuff, but I really am not sure how a lot of it was done. So if you want to talk about how, you were recording and playing what you were playing, and how that was synced up with the video in general, and then I can ask you specific questions.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, it may be a lot less complicated than it seems. Actually, it's just, for me, it was actually like one of the most straightforward and quick things that I've done in a really long time, because it was recorded in 4 successive takes. So I sat down and I played one take, which was the, first pass through the performance. And then after that, I overdubbed 3 more performances, to create like a quartet, basically. And I had sort of loosely organized the piece into 5 like sub chapters or movements, and I had determined pieces one, three, and five were versions of pre-existing material. One and five have not been released. Three is Before Our Eyes, which is on Breaking English, and I knew that I was going to do movements three and five solo. So I just like I played the full piece the first time I sat down, and then I did four more takes immediately after that one that were just layered performances on top of movements one, two, and four. So movements one, two, and four are like 4-part guitar, and movements three and five are solo guitar. And the way that it's rendered is just like, I knew that I was going to be shooting this in my living room, and I had an iPhone, and that was my camera. But I was trying to think. I kept thinking about, and I think I said this in the questions after the performance, the way that like when people first started recording things, or like the advent of recording technology, it was just about trying to bottle the experience of a live performance and be able to like not have to leave your living room but still feel like you're at a private concert, or like your favorite band is there with you in your living room playing for you, your favorite musician or whatever. And recordings never really accomplished that, I don't think. Like even the best, most detailed recordings have not been a substitute for me for being in the room with a great ensemble or performer or something. But there's all this other stuff that you've been able to do on recordings that would have been impossible in a performance setting, and certainly wouldn't be something that was arrived at through the means of performing. And because of that, we're all better off, because there's a whole other set of avenues of creative expression. And indeed, performance is better off because people who play music live have been able to glean all this knowledge from recordings, right? So like coming back to this sort of situation where everybody's using like Zoom and iPhones and stuff to like kind of try to find some way to connect in spite of the isolation that has been imposed upon us, which feels like a very apt metaphor for all of this, like all of what we do in life and in music. And these technologies are all super nascent and frustrating and limited, but also one has to ask the question, like, what could we do with this that we can't really do with a regular performance? And I certainly like can't have an ensemble of four of me, you know what I mean? So, and I hadn't played with anyone, and that was like the closest that, because I just did it quickly, take after take, it was the closest that I'd come to feeling like I was making music with other people.
Was it improvised? How much of it was improvised and how much of it was composed?
You know, I mean, that's always a frustrating dichotomy for me, because they're sort of, yeah, like the structure for improvisation is somewhat specified, and the articulation of what is composed is somewhat improvisatory, or subject to the sort of like feeling of the moment, but loosely speaking, I would say that it was probably like 70 to 80% improvised.
Well, it's amazing because hearing you say that it was overdubbed, I watched it twice and I was thinking that it was generative, that you were somehow playing through a laptop that was, feeding stuff back to you and you were responding to that. Was that something that I think you've done that kind of stuff. So has that influenced the way you play and the way you compose? And
oh, absolutely. And that's what I'm kind of talking about like, when I say that like recording has changed the way that people perform. I'm like speaking about myself more than anyone else, you know, like so much about how I play my instrument at this point is influenced by processes that were born out of studio constructions and things that I've built. Like I was saying, like for me, a lot of my music in the past and especially in recent years has not really involved the guitar very much, and it's been much more of this like sculptural process using other sound sources or the guitar in a way that's like so extrapolated and removed from where the sound even started that it starts to take on its own kind of personality. And so one of the things that I was pleasantly surprised by in doing this performance was actually how much the music seemed to capture all of the attributes that I've been cultivating in that other stuff that like doesn't involve the guitar very much. Like I was honestly nervous that I was going to sit down and play this thing and it wouldn't really have the level of contrasts and counterbalancing and sonic depth and variety that I've been sort of able to achieve more readily with like a unlimited palette. You know what I mean? Like to limit it so severely to like one source of sound was intimidating for me. But I was excited to see that like, oh, actually the way that I play the instrument has changed as a result of all of this very dramatically, and to the point where there's a lot of stuff that I'm doing on the guitar that I know exactly where I'm getting the impulses for it. You know, like there's like movement 2 of the piece is, it's all prepared guitars. I've got like foam in the bridge of the strings, and it kind of gives it this like buzzy Imbira like quality. And the way that I was sort of improvising the layers was kind of like a grain delay or something, you know, and that's possibly why it sounded somewhat generative, is because what I was basically doing with 4 voices that are all panned is to have sound scattering in the stereo image in a way that you might do with like a grain delay, you know, and having it do that and then tighten back up and then get pixelated again and then clarify rhythmically at different moments is like, yeah, it's something that I could easily have seen myself constructing using completely different means.
Well, it's one thing is it speaks to your talent for improvisation, that the sound had the kind of surprise factor that you get from working with generative music. You know, I mean, it sounded like that kind of interaction to a certain extent. And also, yeah, the whole subject is fascinating. I remember when at first the light bulb moment was when I saw Chris Whitley do a live show. I don't know if you know him, a guitar player. After he did this album called Red, where he used a DJ on it, and I saw them do it live, and the drummer was playing much like drums were influenced by drum machines when drum machines came out. This drummer was obviously influenced by samples and by the way people cut samples. And, you know, I mean, in the early days of samples, people didn't have the technique to put in a fill. So instead, for drama's sake, they would put in the drum would just stop and they'd put in like a 2-beat space. And
drummers have also been doing that for a very long time, though, and sometimes that's the best fill, you know.
Yeah, well, it's true. Yeah. I mean, but it was the first time I noticed this guy seemed really influenced by the sample culture, and we've seen that, you know, with Jojo Mayer and you know, all these drummers since, Mark Giuliani, you know, who are influenced by the cut up sample culture. So it's not surprising. And in my own electronic guitar work, I'm looking for some of the same things, using beat repeat to chop things up in a way that I've heard done very painstakingly by people in files. So, but I'm still trying to get my head around the fact that that was how you did it. So once you overdubbed the 4 layers, then how did you incorporate the video? Was that video? Did you shoot yourself doing each layer and then put it together?
Yeah, so I worked with a video artist whose name is Sarah Shakebridge. She and I met because she's been doing some work with the label that I record for, and we have been like sending each other things over Instagram for like, I don't know, like a year or something. Because we started noticing that we had all of this overlap in terms of visual treatments that we both thought were fascinating. And I had this idea because, again, I was like trying to think about, like, I didn't want to have like 4 squares of me playing guitar. It just didn't really fit the music very well. I could have done something like that, but it just would have been very literal. And I was looking for something that would capture more of the feeling of transcendence that I was looking for from the music. And like, there's a certain sort of mirroring in my mind that I've been considering a lot between certain Sufi poetic ideas about the body as a prison, and like the fact that all of us in New York are like locked inside of these little cinder block like apartments, and that this concert is basically like a it's a beacon out from one of those to other ones. And so, yeah, I was just thinking about how I might be able to get at something like that with the video. And I realized that if I shot this thing with my phone on a tripod and I made the setting the same for all 4 performances, not only would that help me like get the material out more quickly so that it would feel more continuous and live, but also the only thing moving in the frame would be my body. And so basically, like, she was able to isolate the movement, and what I did was I exported each of the 4 layers for her as audio, and she developed a audio reactive treatment for the video where, depending on how loud a given layer was, it pulses into the foreground. She's using it's basically the opacity of the layer gets darker the louder the audio content for the source for that layer is. So what it does, because musically I'm doing a lot of this like jittery sort of stuff, the imagery kind of feels like there's like a machine that's breaking, and that's very much like, yeah, I was again, like, had no idea whether or not this was going to work and was excited to see that it did, or it did what I wanted it to anyway.
Yeah, well, it definitely added a kind of ghostly, a ghostly image that went very well with the music, but it also looked fantastic. I mean, what iPhone were you using, or did she help with the lighting, or did she do post or something? It just looked amazing.
Well, I mean, I gave my girlfriend Nina Moffat, who's also an incredible musician, a director of photography credit, because she like helped me get this shot, and it involved we didn't really have very many things, but we had just gotten this little tiny like bootleg tripod thing for having FaceTime calls and not having to like hold the phone. So we stacked like a chest with a side table on top of it with a bunch of books, and then we like got the angle for the thing that way, and sort of like, just like intensely got the shot right, made sure I filmed it at the time of day that the light was going to be right coming naturally from the window. And then, the phone is an iPhone 11 Pro or whatever whatever it's called. And I shot it at 4K 60 frames per second on my phone, like unbelievable that that's even possible. And yeah, so I shot it at basically the highest resolution. I had to like leave Dropbox on with like the screen set to not sleep for the entire night, and it like slowly transferred these files to Sarah.
They must have been big.
All the effects at that high resolution, and then it was converted down to streaming specs after that. So
yeah, it looks terrific. And actually shooting it, if you were using natural light, that's always difficult. Like I can see the light shift now as we're talking, but to get consistent light is really, it's probably a little easier in New York with the buildings blocking the direct sunlight, perhaps.
Actually, like sort of the opposite, because we live on Eastern Parkway, which is like a pretty wide road.
Oh, okay. So you have good sun.
Outside. So yeah, like the way that the sun comes in, I know that I have like a reliable couple hours where the light is perfect for the shot. So I just did it. I think all the takes were done in 80 minutes total or something like that, because it was 20 minutes and I just would hit record and then play and then come over, hit record, So, yeah.
So, you're using one of your Flip Scipio guitars for that?
Yeah, I'm a pretty monogamous guitar player, and Flip built this guitar for me a few years ago, which we've talked about before, and I've been playing it pretty constantly ever since. He actually modified another guitar for me recently that I've also been using for things, but it's a baritone guitar that's tuned to B, and I kind of use it more like a bass with an octave pedal most of the time. But yeah, those are like the two instruments that I play all the time.
Well, speaking of octaves, you were getting some high whistling octaves kind of early on. Where did those come from?
That's some settings that I designed on the Eventide H9 pedals. And I really like not only is the transposition like of a better quality to my ear than a lot of other pedals, but they allow you to like manipulate aspects of like basically the onset and decay of the note, and also like the movement between pitches, and that stuff has been super useful to me, especially when blending the pitch transpose signal with a dry signal, and kind of like structuring the envelope of the pitch transposed one in such a way that it plays well with the dry sound.
Do you remember which algorithm you're using? Because I've always been not quite sure which one works best for just the most solid pitch transposition.
I honestly can't remember the names of them. I designed that a really long time ago.
Okay. And we're using that for the bass notes that come in later?
That was a different version. It might have been a different algorithm, but it's the same device. Yeah.
And it looks like there's a large 5-switch MIDI switcher or something on the thing. But one thing I noticed, and another reason I thought it was generative, was that I couldn't match up what you were doing with your hands and feet to the changing sounds. Now, is that because the video layer that might have been used was not necessarily the layer
that you were attending to? Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Now that makes sense because
Yeah, because again, they're basically more present when whatever the sound is louder, and so the sound changing is like the quietest moment, basically, because I'm probably not playing very much when I'm changing the sound, so that's not going to come through as often. And the other thing is that pedal on the floor that you identified as a MIDI switcher also has another function, which is that it switches other pedals in and out of the chain. It's like a router as well.
what they call a loop, like a loop thing. Are they in a are they in a loop in it, or are they switching
Yeah.
them? Yeah.
Yeah, they're all in their own loops and I'm switching them in and out. And the reason why I have that is because, like a lot of times I want to switch to a completely different sound with the press of one button as opposed to eight. So I'll just like, it makes my life a lot easier. I'm not like
Right.
quickly pushing a bunch of switches in the like last bar before the song changes. So that's why I have it. And then it just is a handy way to like kind of control which pedals I want in the sequence.
Who makes that one? I didn't recognize.
It's a company from North Carolina, actually, where I'm from, called Disaster Area Designs.
Oh, sure.
Yeah, and their stuff is held up very well for me. So, yeah.
A question I'm always interested in when it comes to improvisation like that is, how do you know when you're done, either with a section or the whole thing?
Well, I mean, sometimes I just, it really is very much like a momentary determination, like that fourth movement that's really noise heavy. That's like basically these like cascades of expanding noise that all of a sudden contract. That section, I had absolutely no idea how I was going to get out of that. But I sort of noticed a thing happening where towards the end of it, it went from being like very aggressive to sort of like the pulses being like a little bit more, it's almost like the level of aggressiveness in the sound was the same, but the perspective of the listener is like made to peel away from it so it doesn't feel as threatening or something. So I started to do that in the first layer, and so in the second layer I knew that I would introduce some kind of melodic content in that space, and I just had an intuition about the last swell when I did the first one that would be an opportunity to shape the next few layers into an ending. And so I timed the melody to fit in that space, and I could feel when I was playing it what the ending swell, like I could sense my other self like moving towards an ending with the last swell, so I knew that I was gonna like cut it off right there. So I just, that's why like when you say like how much is composed and how much is improvised, all of that was improvised, but it was also me composing a 4-part piece of music. You know what I mean? So it sort of like, I sense an opportunity and I seize it, but it's always very intentional that it's going to end. It's not just like, oh, okay, I guess it's done. Like,
Like a Monty Python sketch. We're just done. Well, yeah, I mean, of course, there's the sense that all great improvisation is composed. I mean, there's an intention. There's hopefully an intention and a sense of an arc and a sense of a beginning and an ending. One of the most amazing things I ever saw was John Abercrombie and Glenn Moore doing a free improv duo, and without looking at each other, they just ended on the same note. And it wasn't a puzzle because from the arc of what they were playing, it was obvious that was the note to end on, and that's what made it a great improvisation. So what were you using for the mayhem distortion section, for distortion?
Well, that sound is So the noise aspect of it is a combination of the Zvex makes that
Yeah.
Fat Fuzz Factory, or they make a fuzz factory, and then they started making a version that they call Fat that has like a sub switch on it. And a couple years ago, they had released, like I use the Fuzz Factory all the time, or the Fat Fuzz Factory all the time, the regular one, which has germanium transistors, I think. And wait, hold on. Yeah, that one has the germanium transistors, and then they had released another one somewhat more recently that had a combination of germanium and silicone transistors, and they had originally had like a blend control on it, but one of them realized that there was really like one spot where it made sense between the two. So I had been by their factory when I was playing in Minneapolis and checked it out and really loved it, but I missed having the sub switch. So they made me one with the sub switch. So that's what I was using for the basis of that sound. And one of the things I really like about that pedal is that it has a gate built into it. And so there's like a lot of things that I'm doing where I'm exploring the sort of like pulsation between beating pitches and using the gate to kind of exaggerate the movement in that. So like it starts to feel like a tremolo that I have control over with my fingers, you know, because depending on the relative intonation of the notes, the speed of the pulsation gets more or less extreme. And I also have a tactile sensibility for like where the threshold of the gate is. So I'm performing in a way that like plays with that basically. And then there's another level of confusion that gets introduced by sending that sound into the eventide pitch algorithm, which is trying to track discrete pitches. And so when you send like basically like microtonal noise into it with like weird beating frequencies and stuff, it starts to confuse it in a way that is of great interest to me. So that's like a lot of the sputtering and kind of like weird tracking aspects of the noise are the result of me confusing the eventide with what I'm sending into that. And of course, there's a lot of volume pedal involved to get the kind of like, I'm kind of constantly shaping all the notes with the volume pedal. I use it like the way that like sidechain compression works. A lot of times I use it just to get the sort of shape that I want out of a gesture. For the first 9 years that I played music, I was a violinist, and I think that just subconsciously has always had like a pretty strong impact on the way that I want the notes to come out. So yeah.
Yeah, I started on violin too, and it made a big difference. And
wait, have we talked about this before?
Possibly about, how it makes it a lot easier when you first start playing guitar to, bend your fingers like that, which most people can't do right away. I was going to ask you, so did you go straight into the amp and mic the amp for this?
I actually went straight into the interface, and the amp is like it's a simulated amp.
Oh.
I went into preamps. I have these Siemens Citrol line amps from the 70s that were modified to be preamps. And so I ran into those and then into my interface, and then I'm basically like simulating an amp in the box using like a chain of plugins. So there's no amp.
What are you using to simulate the amp?
Yeah. Oh my God, it's a lot of things actually. So the main thing is the universal audio, like Fender Twin simulation, but I'm kind of doing a lot of shaping of the sound before and after that. One device that I really recommend that is the best $20 I've ever spent in my entire life is there's a company called Cush Audio, and they make this Omega 458A is the name of the plugin, and it's just a single knob, and it is designed to emulate some tube preamp. I'm assuming it's the 458A. I'm not familiar with the analog design, to be honest with you, but it simulates the sound of tube behavior and saturation in a way that's more accurate than basically anything else that I've heard. And for $20, it's like, come on.
Yeah.
But yeah, it just has one function, and so I use that. That's a big part of what makes the fake amp sound real to my ears, is that plugin.
Are you using it in front of the amp or behind, after the amp?
I honestly can't remember how it ended up playing out. Definitely after, but I think maybe before as well. It sort of depends on how I want the amp to break up, but usually I use it after, because I don't really love the breakup in the UAD amp. Like, it sounds realistic, but it's not really what I go for with. I like for the amp signal to be like on the precipice of starting to break up, but not really, and so it's still, I feel like everything has a little bit of saturation and glue, but it's like a rounder sound that I'm looking for and less prickly, and then I like to control making it prickly with what's on the floor as opposed to like the amp itself. So I think, I'm pretty sure in this instance, I must have put the thing after it. The Omega would have been after the amp.
That's the hardest thing, I've reviewed every single amp modeling system there is, and the hardest thing to do is to get that just on the edge of breakup to sound natural.
Yeah.
They're pretty great in many other ways. I guess finally, well, not finally, but about the video, why did you choose black and white?
I think it definitely, I tend to have a preference for limited color palettes. And sometimes it's, just like a single color that I want to highlight. It's entirely possible that some of that has to do with the fact that I'm moderately red-green colorblind. And so my perception of color is pretty different than a lot of people's. But I tend to there's something, I think color can be a really incredible visual attribute when it is used intentionally. But in the case of this video, it felt like a distraction to me. Like my couch cushions are actually this very beautiful shade of mustard, like the velvet ones. They have this yellowish kind of gold color to them, and they pop out a lot, and I love them. But that's not what I wanted to draw the focus of the shot, So yeah, I think it just has to do with the way that it prioritizes movement and stuff like that. Maybe it's simpler for me. And it was one variable that I absolutely did not have control over in terms of the obviously limited options for where to shoot this.
Right. Oh yeah, of course. It's interesting. Yeah. My wife's an artist, and she could tell that pillow was yellow in the black and white. Because when we watch the end, when you talk at the end, it's in color. And
right.
And she said, "I knew that pillow was yellow." And I totally understand the concept. I mean, I'm a photographer as well, and my decision to whether a photo should be black and white or color, now these days everything could be anything. So I shoot everything these days mostly on the phone, but in color, and then it's just a question: is the color adding or taking away from what it's doing? know, and if it's not adding anything to it, then then you want to focus on the light and the shadow and black and white and all that kind of stuff. So it makes much more sense. So getting back to the Kronos quartet thing, was your guitar for this tuned to the quartet tuning? And either way, what is that tuning?
No, I gave that up immediately after completing that. Although I was talking with David, and he was asking if I would develop a part for me to play with them, so I might have to go back to it, which that would be a great reason to go back to it. But it was, yeah, I just tuned it so the lowest string was down to a C and the highest string was the same E. And it was tuned in fifths, and the G and B string were both tuned to A. So I had a double of that note, basically. But what it did was it allowed me to have the cello range with the bottom four strings of the instrument, and then with a capo at the 12th fret, the bottom four strings became the viola, and then the top five strings, including that one double pitch, gave me the violins. So it gave me, and for my piece, it was important, it was less important in terms of the proximity of the fingered notes. Like there's some like doubles and things like that I wouldn't have had to like tune the guitar into the frequency range to figure this out. But the thing that it was really helpful for was the overtone series being the same as it is on those instruments, or at least roughly speaking, like the harmonics are close, so it allowed me to like, there are certain techniques and parts of the piece where I'm exploiting the sort of like upper partials of certain gestures and things like that, and that was only possible, or at least with my mind, it was most beneficial to me to like tune the instrument that way and actually like hear what it sounded like when I was working on the stuff, as opposed to just imagining it.
That's an interesting way to do it. I mean, a lot of people would have done some sort of MIDI guitar thing and used samples, and it's a different way to approach it, and it's very interesting. When might we be hearing this Kronos recording?
That's a good question. I mean, to go back to the thing that you just said, it's interesting because, as I said, like I started out playing the violin, and I feel like a lot of my approaches to the guitar have been indebted to things that violinists do, and string players do. And so I wanted to kind of like turn it over on itself again and see what it would sound like if string players had to try to emulate the techniques that I had generated that were influenced by them,
Right.
Which is a bit like what we were talking about drum machines, like, hip hop producers like Pete Rock and Dilla and Madlib being influenced by jazz drummers, and then having people like Chris Dave and, Kareem Riggins and folks like that, like taking attributes of how they were programming music and translating it back to the drums. Like I just wanted to see the way that exchange could turn another notch. And the influence for it honestly was, I was checking out a lot of string quartet repertoire around the time that they asked me to do this piece, and one of my favorite things that I heard was actually in the Kronos, like existing pieces for this initiative that I'm writing for, was something that Tanya Tagaq wrote for them, and she recorded 4 layers of her voice as the starting point for what she was doing. And she's a throat singer, and there's all of these like really specific complex timbral gestures that she has cultivated with her voice, and she basically just created something out of that, and they work together to approximate the sound in such a way that Kronos really sounds like her.
Wow.
When you hear them play it, like it really sounds eerily like her. And I just, to me, that's like one of the coolest things that I've heard. And so it inspired me to kind of start from the vantage point of the practice that I've already cultivated and the sounds and techniques that I've developed, and seeing how closely they can be translated into that world, and the amount that I'll learn from that, and having the opportunity to have that kind of exchange with players who are thinking that way is just going to be like a huge learning experience for me, because I'll learn how to communicate some of these ideas going forward. So a big part of my reasoning for doing it that way was like as a cheat sheet for my future self, to know how to notate certain things. But we don't know when it's gonna be available. Obviously, the quarantine and everything has changed the timelines for these things somewhat significantly. But hopefully sooner rather than later.
So were you processing the guitar? I'm sorry.
Oh, sorry.
Were you processing the guitar, sending them processed guitar that they are then going to try and emulate the processing that you put on the guitar?
I mean, it's sort of similar to what I did for the Sawdust thing, in that I'm playing the way that I play, and the sounds are, each movement is sort of situated in its own world of sound. And yeah, there's some, like the second movement is pretty much unprocessed, and the third movement is heavily processed, and the first movement is kind of in between. So it's like, but either way, it sounds fundamentally different, because the mechanisms for generating the sounds are just like not the ones that they're using. But it doesn't sound like a guitar either, I guess is what I would say. Like it's not that and so I'm hoping that the result will not really sound exactly like string quartet.
Right.
And that's the thing that to me is like, in everybody that's inspired me the most, when you hear their music, it doesn't sound like the instrumentation, or it doesn't sound like the things that were, the tools that were used to make it. It just sounds like the musical concept and the idea. Like, equipment is great, and it's nice to be able to think about different interfaces that you can use to generate ideas. But ultimately, like, I'm just hoping that it can be more about articulating a certain vision of what you want something to sound like, and using the tools at your disposal to get to that.
Yeah, of course. I mean, you're trying to get an emotional and well, I guess an intellectual on a certain level, but emotional response to the music. And that's, everything else is just a tool to provide that, it's just a palette to create the art, for sure. Before we go, I just wanted to tell you, I really missed going to Big Ears this year, but I missed it a little less because the year before, when you were playing, it was the year before, right? It was 2 years ago. Did you play? You played the last Big Ears, yeah. I mean, that was one of the top modern guitar festivals of all time. I mean, between you and Bill Frisell and Torn and Anthony Perogue and the Aesthetics, it was just one mind-boggling.
Mary Halverson was there too.
Oh, I forgot. Yeah, don't let me forget Mary. Yeah, I mean, it was mind-boggling. But I have to say, your show was possibly the best show that I saw in the whole performance. Yours and the Aesthetics, I would say, were the two most amazing shows I've seen. And I hope, I mean, obviously no one knows what's going to happen, but are there any plans in the future to get get the band back together and maybe do more performances?
I mean, that's the band that those are the two musicians that I would rather play with than anybody in the world. And they're also the two musicians that I've been lucky to play with more than anyone else in the world. That bass player that you heard, his name is Jackson Hill, and he and I have been working together since we were in high school. We learned how to play together. And so I work with him as often as possible. And then Ian and I play in Sunlux, and then we also work on both of our projects with each other. So that's definitely my first choice if and when this all, moves into a situation where some version of playing music with other people is possible. I certainly hope that we'll do more together, and we have tentative plans to do more things, but it's just a question of how and when. But yeah, and actually one of the things that got canceled right at the start of all of this that I had been super excited about was that band was going to play some of that music at Queen Elizabeth Hall in London with the BBC Concert Orchestra. And unfortunately that may or may not happen now, but that's something that has been tentatively rescheduled for next year. And I hope they don't mind me saying this. I think it's cool. But yeah, assuming that it's possible by the time we're supposed to do it again, it will happen again. Yeah.
We may have to fly over to see that because that would be in London, I assume.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, because we have friends in London and Leeds, and it would be worth the trip. Is there a new Rafiq record in the works?
Yes, there is. Okay. I'm not sure when it'll be done, but okay. There's a lot of other things going on as well right now. But yeah, I've been working on one for a while. And some of the music that I sort of versioned in the Sawdust concert are things that are currently in the running for the record. So,
well, we'll have to talk again when that comes out.